So there is an inherent paradox when it comes to these far-right women influencers, which is on the one hand, they advocate for these very traditionalist interpretation of gender roles and gender norms. And yet, on the other hand, they are the sort of de facto women leaders of the far right. When it comes to defining the far right, I tend to focus on both the side of ideology as well as different organizations. So ideology would be those that promote extreme nationalism, nativism, and authoritarianism as a combination of those. And then in terms of organizations, I look at the really long history and legacy of different types of far-right organizations. So this could be, say, political parties, which is much more common in Europe, but also it could be social movements or different online cultures and communities, as well as offline cultures and subcultures. So I look at these two combined in terms of both ideology and organizations. And with the focus of the book, I actually turned towards the so-called alt-right, which was in many ways, I argue, the most contemporary manifestation of the far right. So it's a continuing legacy of the far right. And the alt-right I describe as fitting within a certain place and time. So when I started off writing this book, it was when Trump was president, and so the alt-right was really the type of social movement amongst far-right activists that led to Trump's election and then presidency. So when I talk about the alt-right, it's more specifically within the time frame of 2016 to 2019, and primarily based in North America, although we see some connections elsewhere to Europe and Australia, for example. So the book is called The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization, and it was just published in September with Columbia University Press. And in the book, I reflect upon 3 years of doing in-depth digital ethnographic research following a select number of far-right women who are very active on social media as influencers. And so the focus is on North America, although I also look at some transnational connections to Europe and Australia and the ties between far-right women political activists within these different geographical contexts. The alt-right has a more sanitizing label to it because many of these activists started calling themselves the alt-right, even though they had the same beliefs as previous far-right movements. For example, beliefs in theories like the Great Replacement or some neo-Nazi beliefs, even beliefs like Holocaust denial. And that's why it became a contested term, especially amongst the academic community, because would we call these actors a more sanitizing label of the alt-right in terms of legitimizing their platforms, or was it really just a continuation of the far-right's activism, but presented in a more friendly face? With the alt-right, it very much grew out of a online community and movement. So in the book, I argue that when we want to understand the so-called alt-right and the current far right today, it's really important to situate it within the emergence of technology and online communities. So when it comes to the focus of the book, which is the women of the far right, I first want to start off by how this drove my interest in writing the book, because when we think about the far right, it tends to conjure up certain images about angry young men, and especially angry young white men in Western societies. And when it comes to this stereotype, I knew that there were women within the far right who were playing quite a significant role within this space, and there was very little attention being placed on these women. In fact, I think the last academic book written about women in the far right was in 2002 with Kathleen Blee's book, and so I knew that there needed to be an update in terms of looking at the contemporary far right scene. And my main argument that these women play in terms of their role within the far right is that they primarily normalize and legitimize far right ideology and ideas for mainstream audiences. And this is what separates them from a lot of their male counterparts. So while these far-right women were also, say, providing political commentary on YouTube or offering hot takes on current events, just like their male counterparts, what drove my interest in these women was how they would present themselves on other platforms, like Instagram, for example, in order to paint this more holistic picture of themselves. So while they were doing YouTube political commentary, they were also posting about their dinner that they were cooking that night or gardening with their children. And this type of more holistic image that I argue is part of their metapolitical strategy. And by that, I mean they are trying to push for a long-term societal change when it comes to cultural and social values, and they try to model that lifestyle for their audiences. And I think that is what separates them from, say, their male counterparts, because they are trying to model this lifestyle in which they merge both their political ideology along with their personal lifestyle and branding. When I first started off writing this book, I had assumed most of these far-right women influencers were recruiting other women into the movement. I mean, why else would they not be there? But interestingly, I found that, at least on YouTube as a platform, they tended to actually have more male viewers and subscribers. And indeed, one of them had even mentioned that she looked at her YouTube analytics and she saw that 85% of her viewers were male, which was quite a shocking number to me. But then I found that, at least on platforms like Instagram, in which they were using the platform in different ways compared to YouTube, for example, they tended to have a lot more female followers. And on Instagram, they would be posting topics related to health and wellness, or to food and cooking, or maybe to things related to child rearing and being a homemaker. And so these women are very adept at tailoring their messages towards both their male and female followers, and using various platform affordances, whether that be YouTube or Instagram, in order to try to target those audiences in different ways. Something that I think is often overlooked is in terms of how they would use notions of gender within their radicalization narratives. So for men, they tend to focus upon aspects of masculinity. So they claim that society is anti-men, that it is controlled by feminists, and that this prohibits men from exercising their, quote, natural biological forms of masculinity, like leadership, aggression, dominance, and that if men join the far right, they can exercise these traits of masculinity and ideally find a traditional submissive wife. But then for the woman, it's often narratives revolved around this notion of a sisterhood, and that if women do join the far right, they'll find that type of like-minded women who are more conservative and traditionalist in their gender norms, and be able to find that sisterhood within the far right. So they're very good at tailoring their content towards both men and women in these ways. So a micro-celebrity is a term that was coined by the media scholar Teresa Sempt in 2008, and it refers to a particular tactic that online celebrities will use in order to garner interest from their audiences. And a micro-celebrity is more specifically a celebrity with a very niche audience. So I apply this concept in my book to refer to these women within the far right who are micro-celebrities within the far right community online. And micro-celebrities, interestingly, use specific tactics in order to seem relatable to their online audiences. So specifically, these practices are being relatable, accessible, authentic, and responsive to their followers and to their viewers. And so I apply this concept when I discuss the way that these far-right women engage with their viewers. So they use certain tactics, like how they might use certain affordances of platforms, for example, on Instagram, using certain features like the poll function to solicit engagement, or perhaps using a countdown sticker on posts to build sort of that anticipation for their audiences in terms of their forthcoming content. When it comes towards how they use these micro-celebrity tactics in their own content creation and production, they do so in ways to enhance their personal brands. So oftentimes they will blend the glamour of celebrity and with the intimacy of influencer culture, so that in many ways they're selling both their political ideology and their personal lifestyle. So for example, what they might do is post a behind-the-scenes video of, say, their honeymoon, in which they will share with their audiences their experiences. And they're literally inviting their audiences into a very private and intimate moment of their lives and showcasing that as a type of performance. And then oftentimes they will take what is a personal decision, that is getting married and going on a honeymoon, and weaponize that actually into a political act. And they will say that society is anti-marriage, anti-traditional nuclear family unit, and that what they are doing is an act of political rebellion. So this is a prime example of how they might merge both their political ideology with their personal lifestyle. So my core argument is that these far-right women women will employ these types of micro-celebrity practices as effective radicalization and recruitment strategies. And I argue that this has a really prime effect in terms of how they then normalize and legitimize a lot of far-right ideas into ways that are easily relatable and digestible to their audiences. In terms of the question about how they might use scientific approaches in their radicalization and recruitment strategies, oftentimes they will cherry pick certain scientific articles, and these are peer-reviewed scientific articles from academic journals, in order to make their claims about their interpretation of traditional gender norms. And this is a very effective practice because it not only demonstrates how they're able to construct this aura of legitimacy for their audiences, but how that is utilized to argue for truth and validation of their lifestyle and practices. They might pick a study from an academic journal which promotes this notion that men and women are happier in traditional gender roles, such as tasks within the household. And they will use this argument then to say that women and men will be happier if the woman is a homemaker at home and the husband is the traditional or primary breadwinner for the family working outside of the home. Oftentimes, though, because they are selective in their interpretation of these scientific findings, they may not actually read the entire study and only cherry pick what fits within their narrative, or they might neglect that there actually are studies that do debunk that original study. So it is a very selective interpretation of this scientific knowledge to fit their worldview. It also, I think, is an effective radicalization tool because oftentimes these women will be recruiting what they see as, quote, recovering feminists. So these are women who might have more secular, progressive backgrounds, who might be, say, well-educated and looking for what they see as the antidote to feminism. And so that, for these far-right women, is traditionalism. And so they will actually try to use that training and that background in order then to recruit women who may not actually have pre-existing traditional or conservative viewpoints. So the concept of generational amnesia is a concept that was developed by climate change scientists, and it actually refers to the endangerment of certain biological species over several generations. So the idea, for example, is that there might be, say, a species of fish in abundance within one generation, but then there might be a depopulation of that fish for the second generation. And that second generation then witnesses that species of fish decline over a period of time until we arrive to the third generation. And so the third generation then accepts that current level of fish population to be natural, not knowing that over several generations there has been a decline over time. And so this concept of generational amnesia that's developed by climate change scientists is something that I also apply when it comes towards understanding the gains of women's rights, feminist rights, and LGBTQ rights over a period of several generations, so that our current generation might take for granted the advances that have been made by these movements in a progressive manner. So I use this concept because I think it's quite vital when it comes towards countering a lot of the myths that are propagated by far-right activists when it actually comes towards understanding the gains that have been made from feminism. So there is this notion amongst far-right activists that is reproduced, which is the idea that things used to be better in the past. And so again, this is a prime example of generational amnesia because the realities of the lived experiences of those in the past does not actually match the notion that things were actually better back in the day. And this ties in very well to the concept of nostalgia. There is this supposed nostalgia for the 1950s and 1960s, saying that women and men were supposedly better, quote, back in the golden days because they enjoyed a level of prosperity. Now, the reality is for many people in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly if you came from marginalized groups, such as women, you actually had suffered quite a lot of societal obstacles in terms of women were not offered the same types of job opportunities as men were back in the 1950s and 60s. There was also issues such as widespread unhappiness, especially amongst homemakers, as Brady Friedan has written about, but also things such as rampant domestic abuse, as well as repressed sexuality. When it comes then to the far right's claims that things were simply better back in the day, this very much ignores the vast structural and systemic issues that particularly women had faced. So I argue in my research that these far-right women influencers still effectively use mainstream platforms, and I primarily focus on YouTube and Instagram in my research because these are very visually oriented platforms, and they exploit the publicness of those platforms in order to garner wide audiences. And so I argue that actually it's the products of amplification and visibility on these mainstream platforms that they exploit to get their messaging across. Unlike their male counterparts, many of whom have actually faced suspension or having their accounts banned on mainstream platforms, these women have not suffered the same type of repercussions in terms of what they post on mainstream platforms. And I argue that this is then a strategy that they exploit when it comes to their propaganda. So for example, they might host an interview with a far-right male activist on their platforms who has been banned, but because they still enjoy the visibility that they have on YouTube, they host that interview on their channel. Now, these women will use the so-called alt-tech or fringe platforms, but oftentimes it's more to be used as backup libraries or archives, because they do say often that they might be banned anytime from those mainstream platforms, although it has been several years that they've remained and continued to grow their audiences. And so they might use some of these alt-tech or fringe platforms, but not as frequently as they do with the mainstream ones. So when it comes to the notion of banning, often this concept of deplatforming, which is permanently suspending a user or an account, this is what we might think of as the default when it comes to a content moderation tool with the far right. And suspension is a temporary form of deplatforming, so that can range from a day to perhaps a few months. Now, when it comes to deplatforming measures, these women have not actually received any repercussion of deplatforming on their accounts. Sometimes they might receive suspensions, but oftentimes that's because they might be spreading disinformation, for example, and so that is clearly violative on these platforms, community guidelines. But sometimes it might be because they might show, for example, a photo of their husband's face, and their husband is banned from that platform. And so then they will actually find creative ways to circumvent the flagging of their content, for example, using an emoji to cover their husband's face, and then they're still able to post that same content on, say, an alt-tech or a fringe platform, undoctored, unfiltered. And so that certainly poses dilemmas when it comes towards assessing the cross-platform posting activity of these women and what might be the repercussions that they may or may not face in terms of their online presence across multiple platforms. So because these far-right women influencers are able to enjoy so much visibility and amplification on these platforms, they very much have profited from them as well. So this often comes in the form of sponsors and advertising revenue that they receive primarily on YouTube, but also on Instagram, for example, where they were often in a collaboration with different, say, health and wellness companies, and they will be sponsored by products in which they will link discount codes to their followers. So I document this throughout the book. But sometimes these sponsors are ideological as well as non-ideological in motivation. And for example, they might be sponsored by a company that provides emergency survival kits, often these freeze-dried food products that will last for 25 years or so, also water filtration kits. And I've noticed that these sponsors will often coincide with the type of content that is being produced by these women. So for example, during the pandemic, and particularly during the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw these types of companies sponsoring these women more and more frequently on their live streams, which indicates who their primary demographic market is in terms of these women's followers. And sometimes it could be companies that are, for instance, an organic cotton tampon company, which might have a clear ideological message. These tampon companies might reinforce the messaging that periods and menstruation is only for women. And so it's against the inclusive language of, say, LGBTQ values that look at those persons who might have reproductive abilities but may not identify as a cis woman in this instance. And so this type of company also sponsors these far-right women influencers. But then sometimes we've also noticed, interestingly, these companies target these far-right women influencers who may not actually have viewers that align with the anticipated demographic. So another actually organic cotton tampon company that sponsored an influencer is the same one who said that 85% of her viewers are male. So there's obviously a disjunction there between what the company believes that these women's viewers are versus who they actually are in these instances. And in addition to the sponsors and the advertising revenue that these women receive, they also actually create their own merchandise. And so often they will utilize these print-to-order companies that create things ranging from apparel like sweatshirts and t-shirts to mugs. And they will print off slogans that these women will popularize in their own YouTube channels. So that is another income generation avenue. But then sometimes they also will engage in writing books, or they might be columnists for magazines, and that is an additional form of revenue, which actually has a long history when it comes to far-right women's political activism and how they would traditionally write books. But what I argue is different today is how these women are oftentimes able to solicit feedback from their followers along that creation process. So sometimes they will pull their followers certain questions about what they would like to see included in that material. And this type of interactive engagement is very much characteristic of the contemporary far-right today. These women see themselves primarily as the wives and mothers of the far-right movement, and they will often utilize that position to engage in notions of prepper and survivalist, as well as homesteading lifestyles, and they will post, for instance, flat lays of the various pantry supplies that they stock up for their families in anticipation of what they see as, for example, an upcoming racial civil war. And so they tie in these notions of a prepper and survivalist mentality into ways that are actually quite digestible and often very aesthetic on platforms like Instagram for their followers. So demonetization is just one tool that platforms can use at their disposal when it comes to content moderation of accounts like these far-right women influencers. It's been primarily used by companies like YouTube in the past in order to restrict the ability for these women to solicit sponsors or advertising revenue of the viewers of their channels. On Instagram, we actually haven't seen too many efforts towards demonetization of these women. They are still, for example, advertising discount codes from sponsors, and so I think this is certainly an avenue that needs to be pursued when it comes to thinking about demonetization. But there are actually other interesting ways that we can counter the far-right influencers that I detail in the book. So, for example, there are, compared to, say, the hard approaches or the more repressive measures like technical tools that are employed by platforms, there's often an avenue of softer approaches that we could use. So one example of this is counter-narratives, which often involves governments, civil society, and platforms working together to create positive narratives that will often be in the form of campaigns to help debunk a lot of these far-right myths. And one of the most pioneering tools of this is the so-called redirect method, which is a resource that, quote, redirects users to resources and information that might provide debunking or de-radicalization information. Now, in terms of the effectiveness of tools like redirect, that is less convincing, in part because there just isn't that much research looking into the effectiveness of that tool. So it is still a space to watch as it evolves. But I think actually what is an often underutilized tool are those of counter-influencers. So these are individuals on various platforms who organically try to create content that will debunk far-right myths in propaganda. And there has been some preliminary studies looking into the effectiveness of counter-influencers, and what has been found is how important it is to assess what is their motivation or perhaps their ideology for creating this type of content, what are the various strategies that they employ for audience engagement, and what are the potential risks if we might include them in a more formal mechanism when it comes to, say, government-sponsored government extremism programs. One very prominent influencer is Abby Richards, who's on TikTok, and she creates really easily digestible infographics about disinformation and conspiracy theories. So there is an inherent paradox when it comes to these far-right women influencers, which is on the one hand, they advocate for these very traditionalist interpretation of gender roles and gender norms. And yet, on the other hand, they are the sort of de facto women leaders of the far right because they're in such visible positions. And it is a paradox because they do argue that within the far right, they're able to enjoy this type of agency and empowerment in terms of being quite visibly presented for the movement. And the truth is they actually do receive also quite a reactionary backlash, even amongst other far-right activists. So for example, they will receive criticism from their male followers, and I've seen this in different forums online, but also in the live chats when it comes to live streams, and they will try to dismiss those comments saying, if you say such misogynistic or sexist comments, we're going to kick you off of the live stream. And so I don't want to paint a glossy picture in saying that there is always acceptance of their positioning within the far-right movement. They do receive quite a lot of misogynistic reactionary backlash, but these women will often justify it by saying, if I don't speak out, who will? So there is this notion that, they need to be at the forefront of the movement because they understand that they play quite a significant role when it comes to continuing that legitimation and that normalizing of far-right ideas into the mainstream. So they definitely support the men within the movement in terms of how men should be considered at the top leadership positions. And they see their roles as supporting, quote, our men within the far-right. But then they also see a duty for themselves in terms of being those supportive mothers and wives within the movement. So in many ways, they see their positioning within this space as, fighting the battle, but perhaps from a different vantage point.